The first transmission crackled through the static at 3:47 hours, Pacific Standard Time. Control towers from San Diego to Seattle picked up the same impossible signal, a call sign that hadn't been heard in over 2 decades, requesting immediate emergency clearance for a commercial airliner that didn't exist on any flight manifest. The voice was steady, professional, carrying the unmistakable cadence of military precision, but it belonged to someone who should have been dead. Tower, this is Ghostwriter Actual, requesting priority landing, heavy damage, souls on board 312. The transmission cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade, sending duty officers scrambling for their protocol manuals. Ghostwriter, a call sign retired after the Kandahar incident, a call sign that belonged to Captain Delilah Raven Morrow, whose F-16 had been shot down over hostile territory 23 years ago. Her remains were never recovered. Her file was sealed, classified beyond most clearance levels. Yet here was that voice, calm as winter air, piloting what radar showed as a massive Boeing 777 limping through restricted airspace at impossible angles. The aircraft's transponder flickered between codes, its altitude readings inconsistent, as if the plane itself was caught between realities. Ground control at Miramar Naval Air Station watched their screens with growing unease as the ghost signature approached, defying every law of aerodynamics they knew. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Viper Kane was pulling his third consecutive night shift when the call came through his headset. 28 years of air traffic control, and he'd never heard anything that made his blood run cold quite like this. The call sign alone sent him reaching for classified directories he hadn't touched since his early days at Edwards. Ghostwriter was legend myth, the kind of story old-timers whispered about in officer clubs after too many drinks. The legend said she could make any aircraft dance, that she'd once landed a crippled F-16 on a carrier deck in weather that should have been impossible. The legend said she'd saved more lives in one tour than most pilots saved in entire careers. The legend also said she died in flames over the Afghan mountains, taking out an entire enemy missile installation with her final kamikaze run. But legends don't file flight plans. Legends don't request emergency vectors through some of the most protected airspace in North America. And legends certainly don't pilot civilian aircraft with the kind of precision that made seasoned air traffic controllers question everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between possible and impossible. The radio crackled again, and this time the impossible became undeniable. Tower, Ghostwriter Actual, I've got wounded on board and failing hydraulics, requesting immediate medical and fire suppression on deck. And Tower, a pause that seemed to stretch across decades, tell the brass that Raven Morrow is coming home. Kane's hands trembled as he reached for the red phone that connected directly to NORAD. Whatever was happening in the skis above California, it was about to rewrite everything they thought they knew about the night Ghostwriter died. The radar blip pulsed steadily, growing larger with each sweep, carrying its impossible cargo toward a dawn that would change everything. In the tower, seasoned controllers held their breath, watching the resurrection of a legend unfold at 300 miles per hour. Major General Patricia Hawthorne hadn't slept properly in 18 months, not since taking command of the Joint Pacific Air Defense Initiative. The call that dragged her from restless dreams came at 3:52 hours, and the words that followed made her question whether she was still sleeping. "Ma'am, we have a situation. Call sign Ghostwriter is requesting emergency landing at Miramar." Confirmed voice matched to Captain Delilah Morrow, KIA 2001. The general's feet hit the cold floor of her quarters running. She'd been a second lieutenant when Ghostwriter went down, fresh out of the academy and assigned to her first combat intelligence briefing. Even then, Morrow's reputation preceded her like thunder before lightning. The woman could read weather patterns that didn't exist yet, could feel mechanical failures before instruments detected them, could land aircraft in conditions that violated every safety protocol ever written. Hawthorne dressed in record time, her mind racing through classifications and clearances. through the sealed reports she'd read years later when her security level finally granted access to the Kandahar files. The official record was clean, sanitized. Captain Morrow's aircraft suffered catastrophic failure during routine patrol. Pilot declared MIA, presumed KIA. The real file, buried under layers of need-to-know restrictions, told a different story entirely. The secured elevator to the command center seemed slower than usual. Hawthorne's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a career officer approaching 50, gray threading through regulation-cut brown hair, lines earned through 2 decades of impossible decisions. But her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had caught Morrow's attention during a brief encounter at Nellie's Air Force Base, 3 weeks before Ghost Rider's final mission. The command center buzzed with controlled chaos when she entered. Wall-mounted displays showed radar tracks, satellite feeds, and communication logs streaming across multiple screens. At the center of it all, Lieutenant Colonel Kane stood rigid at his station, headset pressed tight against his ear, speaking in the measured tones that meant everything was going wrong in carefully managed increments. "Status report," Hawthorne commanded, and the room's energy shifted toward her like iron filings toward a magnet. Kane turned, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Ma'am, we have positive voice identification on Captain Morrow, piloting what appears to be a Boeing 777-300ER with severe structural damage. Aircraft is maintaining controlled flight despite reported hydraulic failure. She's requesting priority landing with full emergency response." He paused, swallowing hard. "Ma'am, the radar signature matches no known aircraft configuration. It's like she's flying something that shouldn't exist." Through the reinforced windows of the command center, the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere out there, cutting through the morning air, a dead woman was bringing home 300 souls in an aircraft that radar couldn't quite understand. Hawthorne had spent 28 years learning that the impossible was just another word for classified. She reached for the secure communication console that would connect her directly to the Secretary of Defense. Whatever Delilah Morrow had been doing for the past 23 years, whatever aircraft she was piloting, whatever mission had kept her hidden from the world, all of that would wait. Right now, 300 lives hung in the balance, and Ghost Rider was asking for permission to land. The radio crackled with her voice again, steady as bedrock, carrying the weight of decades. "Miramar Control, Ghost Rider Actual, beginning final approach. It's good to be talking to you again." Captain Elena Phoenix Rodriguez had pulled alert duty countless times in her 8 years flying F-22 Raptors, but she'd never scrambled at dawn to intercept a ghost. The briefing had been minimal: investigate unknown aircraft, call sign Ghost Rider, exercise extreme caution. What they didn't tell her was that Ghost Rider was supposed to be a legend, a story from before she was born, a pilot whose exploits had shaped modern air combat doctrine. Her Raptor cut through the morning sky at Angels 20, stealth systems active, sensor arrays painting a picture that made no sense. The target aircraft appeared on her displays as a massive civilian airliner, but its flight characteristics suggested something else entirely. Commercial aircraft don't maintain controlled flight with the kind of damage her sensors were detecting. Commercial aircraft don't execute precision turns at angles that should cause structural failure. "Control, Phoenix Actual. I have visual on target aircraft." The words caught in her throat as she closed to visual range. The Boeing 777 stretched across her canopy view like a wounded giant, its port engine clearly damaged, scorch marks running along the fuselage, but flying with the kind of precision that made her own Raptor feel clumsy in comparison. The voice that came through her headset carried decades of authority. "Phoenix, this is Ghost Rider. Nice aircraft you've got there. Bet she handles like a dream." The casual confidence in those words sent a chill down Rodriguez's spine. She'd heard recordings of legendary pilots, had studied combat communications at the academy, but this was different. This was a master speaking to a student, even across the vast technological gap between her stealth fighter and that limping airliner. Ghost Rider Phoenix confirmed souls on board and nature of emergency. Rodriguez tried to keep her voice professional, but the surreal nature of the conversation bled through. She was talking to someone who'd been declared dead before Rodriguez had even enlisted. 312 souls Phoenix. Engine failure, hydraulic compromise, structural damage from weather that wasn't supposed to exist. But we're flying, and that's what matters. A pause, then softer. You ever wonder what it's like up here, really up here, where the physics get interesting? Rodriguez blinked, uncertain how to respond. Her training hadn't covered conversation with deceased legends piloting impossible aircraft. Below them, the California coastline stretched toward the rising sun, painting the ocean in shades of gold and silver. At this altitude, the curvature of the Earth was visible, a reminder of how small they all were against the infinite sky. Ghost Rider, how are you maintaining controlled flight with that damage profile? The question was tactical, but also personal. Rodriguez had never seen flying like this, had never imagined it was possible. The answer came wrapped in something that might have been laughter. Phoenix, some things you can't learn from manuals. Some things you only understand after you've died and come back. Stick around, kid. You're about to see flying that'll change how you think about what's possible. As if summoned by her words, the damaged airliner began a descent that defied every principle of aeronautical engineering Rodriguez knew. The massive aircraft dropped toward the deck with the precision of a fighter, bleeding altitude and airspeed in perfect harmony, dancing on the edge of disaster with the confidence of absolute mastery. Rodriguez followed, her Raptor systems recording everything, knowing she was witnessing something that would be studied and debated for decades to come. In the growing light of dawn, Ghost Rider was coming home. Air traffic controller Rebecca Tower Chen had guided thousands of aircraft through Miramar's airspace over her 15-year career, but she'd never watched anything like the approach Ghost Rider was flying. The damaged Boeing descended through layers of morning air with the kind of precision that made veteran pilots weep. Every adjustment was perfect, every correction minimal, as if the aircraft itself was an extension of the pilot's will. Ghost Rider Miramar Tower. Winds 090 at 15, gusting to 22. Runway 24 left is clear, emergency equipment in position. Chen's voice carried the controlled tension of a professional watching the impossible unfold. On her displays, the aircraft's vital signs painted a picture of mechanical systems that should have failed minutes ago, yet somehow continued functioning through sheer determination. Copy Tower, winds noted. Tell your crash crews they can relax, this bird's coming home clean. The confidence in Ghost Rider's voice was absolute, but Chen could hear something else underneath. Exhaustion, maybe, or the weight of carrying 300 lives through whatever hell had brought them here. The Boeing was 5 miles out now, visible through the tower's panoramic windows as a dark silhouette against the brightening sky. Chen focused her binoculars on the approaching aircraft and felt her breath catch. The damage was extensive: scorch marks, structural deformation, one engine clearly compromised, but the plane flew as if it were factory fresh. The gear deployment was textbook perfect, flaps extending in precise sequence, the aircraft settling into its final approach angle with mathematical precision. "Ma'am," her assistant called from the adjacent console, "I'm showing some unusual readings on the aircraft's configuration. The computer keeps trying to classify it as military, then civilian, then something else entirely." Chen didn't respond immediately. Her attention was locked on that descending aircraft, on the way it seemed to bend the very air around it to its will. She'd guided everything from crop dusters to military transports, but this was different. This was artistry at 300,000 pounds and 200 knots. "Ghost Rider, you are cleared to land runway 24 left. Wind check, 095 at 18, gusting to 24. The wind was picking up, adding complexity to an already impossible situation. Cleared to land, 2-4 left. Tower, you might want to record this one for the books. A pause then. Phoenix, you still with me up there? Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the frequency. Copy, Ghost Rider, following you down. That's some impressive flying. Stick around, kid. The landing's the best part. Chen watched through her binoculars as the massive airliner approached the runway threshold. At this angle, the damage was even more apparent. Panels missing, surfaces scorched, the port engine housing clearly compromised. Any other pilot would have declared an emergency, would have requested foam on the runway, would have prepared for a disaster landing. Ghost Rider's gear touched down with the gentleness of a feather settling on still water. The Boeing's wheels met the concrete with barely a puff of smoke, the aircraft tracking perfectly down the center line despite the crosswind that should have pushed it sideways. The damaged engine spooled down smoothly, thrust reversers deploying in perfect sequence. Chen realized she was holding her breath. Around the tower, conversations had stopped. Even the seasoned controllers were watching in silence as the impossible became routine, as legend became reality rolling down runway 24 left at Miramar Naval Air Station. The aircraft reached taxi speed and began its turn toward the terminal, moving with the same impossible precision that had marked its entire approach. Chen reached for her logbook, wondering how she would record what she just witnessed, how she would explain the day a dead pilot brought home 300 souls in an aircraft that shouldn't exist. Emergency medical technician James, Doc Harrison, had seen his share of disaster landings during 12 years working emergency response at Miramar. He'd pulled survivors from burning wreckage, had worked miracles with battlefield medicine in the back of ambulances racing toward trauma centers. But he'd never responded to an aircraft that had supposedly been flying with a dead pilot, and he'd never seen an emergency landing that looked more like a routine arrival. The Boeing 777 sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, surrounded by fire trucks and ambulances whose crews stood ready for catastrophe that hadn't materialized. The aircraft's exterior told the story of whatever hell it had flown through: scorch marks, missing panels, one engine clearly damaged beyond repair. But the landing had been so smooth that many of the passengers were still unaware they just experienced something that would redefine their understanding of what was possible. "Doc, you seeing this?" His partner, Sarah Martinez, gestured toward the aircraft's main cabin door, which was opening with hydraulic precision that should have been impossible given the reported system failures. "That bird should be in pieces, but look at it. It's like she willed it to stay together." Harrison adjusted his medical kit and started toward the aircraft. Around them, the coordinated chaos of emergency response continued, but something was different. The usual urgency was replaced by something closer to reverence, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something that transcended normal operational parameters. The first passengers began descending the mobile stairs, and Harrison was struck by their expressions. He'd evacuated passengers from damaged aircraft before. They were usually shaken, traumatized, desperate to reach solid ground. These passengers looked different. They moved with the calm of people who had been in the presence of something extraordinary, who had experienced fear transformed into absolute confidence. "Ma'am, I'm Doc Harrison, emergency medical. How are you feeling?" He approached a middle-aged woman who was pausing at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at the aircraft with something that might have been gratitude. "She saved us," the woman said simply. "I don't know how, but she saved us all. We were falling, the plane was breaking apart around us, and then—" She paused, searching for words. Then her voice came over the intercom, calm as anything, telling us to trust her, and we did. Harrison nodded, making mental notes for his report while scanning the woman for signs of trauma or injury. Physically, she appeared unharmed, but her eyes held the look of someone who had seen the impossible made manifest. "Did you see the pilot, ma'am?" The woman shook her head. She stayed in the cockpit the whole time, but her voice, I've never heard anything like it, like she was talking to the aircraft itself, like she could make it understand what she needed. She looked back at the Boeing again. I'm a retired aerospace engineer. I spent 40 years designing aircraft systems. What that plane just did, it's not possible, but I was here. I felt it. Similar stories emerged from passenger after passenger. They spoke of impossible maneuvers executed with surgical precision, of mechanical systems functioning far beyond their design parameters, of a pilot's voice cutting through chaos with absolute authority. They described flying through weather conditions that should have torn the aircraft apart, guided by someone who seemed to understand atmospheric physics on a level that transcended textbook knowledge. Harrison worked his way through the crowd of evacuating passengers, finding remarkably few injuries despite the aircraft's obviously traumatic journey. A few cases of motion sickness, some minor cuts and bruises, but nothing that suggested the kind of violent flight that the aircraft's exterior damage implied. Doc, Martinez called from near the aircraft's nose. "You need to see this." Harrison approached the damaged Boeing's forward section, where maintenance crews were beginning their preliminary inspection. What he saw there would stay with him for the rest of his career. Damage that should have been catastrophic, systems that should have failed completely, yet somehow continuing to function with precision that bordered on the supernatural. Major Rebecca Stinger Walsh had been commanding the base's air operations for 3 years, and in that time she'd handled everything from routine training flights to international incidents that never made the newspapers. But she'd never debriefed a pilot who had officially been dead for 23 years, and she'd never tried to explain to her superiors how someone had managed to land a critically damaged airliner with 0 casualties and minimal injuries. The knock on her office door came at 8:47 hours, 43 minutes after the impossible aircraft had rolled to a stop on Miramar's tarmac. "Enter," she called, straightening the papers on her desk that suddenly seemed trivial compared to what was walking through her door. Captain Delilah Raven Morrow looked exactly like the classified photographs in her personnel file, unchanged by the 23 years she'd been officially deceased. The same sharp green eyes, the same confident stride, the same presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She wore a civilian flight suit that had seen better decades, with patches and modifications that suggested extensive use in conditions that probably didn't appear in any flight manual. "Major Walsh, I presume." Morrow's voice carried the same calm authority that had guided 300 souls through whatever nightmare had brought them to Miramar. "I believe we need to talk." Walsh gestured to the chair across from her desk, her mind racing through protocols that had never anticipated this situation. "Captain Morrow, or should I say Ghost?" She paused, uncertain of proper procedure when addressing the officially deceased. "Raven works fine, Major. Call signs are for the radio." Morrow settled into the chair with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in her own skin, despite the impossibility of her situation. "I imagine you have questions." "A few." Walsh opened the classified folder that contained everything the Air Force officially knew about Delilah Morrow's service record. "According to our records, you were shot down over Afghanistan in 2001. Your aircraft was destroyed. No survivors recovered." "That's correct." Morrow's expression didn't change. Captain Delilah Morrow, call sign Ghost Rider, was declared killed in action on November 15, 2001. Her F-16C suffered catastrophic failure during a classified mission over hostile territory. The aircraft and pilot were both listed as total losses. Walsh studied the woman across from her desk. "But you're sitting here." "I am." Morrow smiled, and for a moment her expression carried something that might have been sadness or relief or the weight of carrying secrets for 2 decades. "Major, what do you know about experimental aerospace programs? The kind that don't appear in congressional budgets?" The question sent a chill through Walsh's office. She'd held clearances that allowed access to some of the military's most sensitive programs, But there were always rumors of projects that existed beyond even classified oversight. Programs that pushed the boundaries of physics and possibility, guided by necessity, and protected by layers of deniability that went all the way to the top. I know they exist, Walsh said carefully. Then you know that sometimes, when a pilot is declared killed in action, it's because the alternative would require explanations that national security can't afford. Morrow leaned forward, her green eyes intense. For 23 years, I've been flying missions that officially never happened, testing aircraft that don't exist, pushing the envelope of what's possible when the stakes are high enough to justify the impossible. Outside Walsh's window, the damaged Boeing sat surrounded by investigators and maintenance crews, its very presence a testament to capabilities that transcended conventional understanding. Walsh looked at her classified folder, at the sanitized reports and sealed files, and realized she was about to learn truths that would change everything she thought she knew about the sky above. The secure phone on General Hawthorne's desk hadn't stopped ringing since news of Ghostwriter's landing reached the Pentagon. She'd fielded calls from the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, and intelligence directors whose agencies weren't supposed to acknowledge each other's existence. Each conversation followed the same pattern: disbelief, demands for explanation, and thinly veiled threats about the consequences of security breaches. The latest call came from a number that didn't officially exist, connected to offices that appeared on no organizational charts. "General, this is Director Thompson. We need to discuss the situation at Miramar." Hawthorne had been expecting this call. Thompson's organization operated in the spaces between official military branches, handling projects that required both unlimited budgets and absolute secrecy. If anyone knew the truth about what Delilah Morrow had been doing for the past 2 decades, it would be Thompson. "Director, I assume you're familiar with Captain Morrow's service record." Hawthorne kept her voice neutral, but her free hand was already reaching for the classified filing cabinet that contained documents she'd hoped never to access. "Intimately familiar, General. Captain Morrow has been one of our most valuable assets since her official death in 2001. Her work has prevented several international incidents that would have destabilized global security." A pause, then. "Her current situation, however, represents a significant challenge to operational security." Through her office windows, Hawthorne could see the unusual amount of activity around the flight line. Media helicopters circled at the mandatory distance, but their cameras were undoubtedly capturing images that would require extensive censorship. Air Force security teams were establishing perimeters that would keep civilian observers away from the damaged Boeing, but questions were already being asked that had no official answers. "Director, what exactly has Captain Morrow been flying for the past 23 years?" The question had been burning in Hawthorne's mind since the first impossible radar contact. "Aircraft that push the boundaries of current technology, General. Experimental platforms that combine conventional aeronautics with propulsion systems derived from unconventional sources." Captain Morrow's unique combination of piloting skill and security clearance made her ideal for testing platforms that require both technical expertise and absolute discretion. Hawthorne felt a familiar chill that came with accessing information classified beyond normal military oversight. "Unconventional sources, Director." "General, in 1947, an incident occurred near Roswell, New Mexico. Official records list it as a weather balloon. The actual recovered materials were transferred to specialized research facilities, where they've been studied and reverse-engineered for over 70 years. Some of that research has produced technologies that are extraordinary." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that stretched far beyond normal military operations. Hawthorne had heard rumors, whispers in secured briefing rooms about programs that operated with technology decades ahead of publicly acknowledged capabilities. She'd always assumed they were just rumors. Director, are you telling me that Captain Morrow has been test piloting aircraft built with recovered alien technology? I'm telling you that national security sometimes requires pilots who can handle aircraft that operate beyond conventional physics. General, Captain Morrow has been doing exactly that for 23 years. Yesterday's emergency represents the first time she's had to bring one of those aircraft into public view. Hawthorne looked out at the damaged Boeing again, its impossible presence suddenly making terrible sense. What's our next move, Director? Damage control, General. Captain Morrow and her aircraft need to disappear again, preferably before congressional oversight committees start asking questions we can't answer. But first, we need to debrief her about whatever forced her to break cover after 2 decades of perfect operational security. The secure line went dead, leaving Hawthorne alone with knowledge that would reshape her understanding of everything above the clouds. Outside, the impossible aircraft waited, carrying secrets that could change the world or destroy it, depending on who controlled the narrative. Technical Sergeant Michael Wrench Patterson had been maintaining military aircraft for 18 years, and he thought he'd seen every possible configuration of damage and jury-rigged repair. But as he climbed into the Boeing 777's cargo hold, flashlight in hand, he entered a world that redefined his understanding of what aircraft could be and do. The interior modifications were unlike anything in any manual he'd studied, combining conventional aerospace engineering with technologies that seemed to operate on principles he couldn't identify. "Jesus Christ," whispered his assistant, Airman First Class Jennifer Torres, as her flashlight beam swept across systems that definitely hadn't come from Boeing's factory floor. "Sarge, what the hell is this stuff?" Patterson moved deeper into the cargo compartment, his trained eye cataloging modifications that should have made the aircraft unflyable. Additional power systems were integrated seamlessly with the Boeing's original electrical grid, but their design suggested energy sources that operated far beyond conventional jet fuel combustion. Control interfaces were mounted at strategic points throughout the cargo area, displaying readouts in symbols that weren't in any technical manual he'd ever seen. "Tours, start photographing everything, but keep those images classified. This goes straight to the intelligence boys." Patterson ran his hands along conduits that hummed with energy, feeling vibrations that didn't match any mechanical system he knew. The modifications were extensive but somehow harmonious, as if the aircraft had been transformed into something that transcended its original design parameters. His flashlight beam caught something that made him stop breathing. Mounted along the cargo hold starboard wall was a propulsion unit unlike anything he'd encountered in nearly 2 decades of aircraft maintenance. It was roughly cylindrical, about the size of a jet engine, but its surface was smooth metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No visible intake, no exhaust ports, no mechanical connections to traditional aircraft systems. "Sarge, you need to see this." Torres was examining the cockpit access ladder, her voice tight with controlled amazement. "These controls, some of them aren't labeled in English. Hell, some of them aren't labeled in any language I recognize." Patterson joined her at the ladder, looking up toward the flight deck where Captain Morrow had somehow guided this impossible aircraft through conditions that should have destroyed it. The modifications extended throughout the Boeing structure, creating a hybrid that combined the familiar with the utterly alien. Every system showed signs of use, of practical application under extreme conditions, suggesting that whatever Captain Morrow had been doing for the past 23 years involved regular flights in aircraft that operated beyond conventional limitations. His radio crackled with a priority message. "Sergeant Patterson, report to Colonel Walsh's office immediately. Bring all documentation and photography from your inspection. Classification level Alpha 7. Patterson had never worked on anything classified at Alpha 7 level. He'd heard rumors of projects that existed at that classification, but he'd never expected to encounter them personally. He looked around the cargo hold one more time, at modifications that represented technology decades ahead of anything publicly acknowledged, at evidence of capabilities that could revolutionize human understanding of flight itself. Tours secure this area. Nobody enters without written authorization from General Hawthorne herself. He climbed back down the access ladder, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd discovered. And tours, everything you've seen here today never happened. We were never here. As he walked across the tarmac toward the command building, Patterson realized that his 18 years of aircraft maintenance experience had just become irrelevant. Whatever Captain Morrow had been flying, whatever missions she'd been conducting in the classified shadows above the world, they represented a level of technology that would require completely relearning everything he thought he knew about the physics of flight. The damaged Boeing sat behind him like a sleeping dragon, its secrets hidden beneath layers of classification that reached all the way to the deepest levels of national security. Patterson had spent his career keeping aircraft in the sky, but today he discovered that the sky itself was far stranger than anyone had imagined. Dr. Elizabeth Data Martinez had analyzed flight recorder information from thousands of aircraft during her 12-year career with the National Transportation Safety Board, but she'd never encountered data that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics with each recorded second. The Boeing's flight data recorder painted a picture of aeronautical impossibility, tracking maneuvers that should have torn the aircraft apart in atmospheric conditions that didn't match any weather service records. Her computer screens filled with telemetry that challenged every principle she'd learned in graduate school. The aircraft had maintained controlled flight through wind shear that registered beyond instrument capabilities, had executed turns at bank angles that exceeded structural design limits, and had landed with hydraulic systems that showed zero pressure yet somehow continued functioning. The data was clean, uncorrupted, and absolutely impossible. Dr. Martinez, what's your preliminary assessment? Colonel Walsh's voice carried the tension of someone dealing with information that threatened to overwhelm existing understanding. She stood behind Martinez's workstation in the specialized analysis center that had been hastily established in a secured hangar, surrounded by classification warnings that went beyond anything Martinez had previously encountered. Colonel, according to this data, Captain Morrow flew this aircraft through atmospheric conditions that don't exist on Earth. Martinez highlighted specific data points on her primary monitor. These pressure readings, these temperature fluctuations, these gravitational variations, they suggest flight through environments that we simply don't have on this planet. The implications hung in the air between them like unexploded ordnance. Martinez had spent her career investigating aircraft accidents, analyzing the mechanical and human factors that caused conventional aircraft to fail under normal circumstances. This data suggested flight through circumstances that weren't merely abnormal, they were impossible. Dr. Martinez, I need you to consider the possibility that Captain Morrow has access to aircraft modifications that operate beyond publicly acknowledged technology. Walsh moved closer to the monitors, her expression grave. Classification restrictions prevent me from being more specific, but I need your analysis to account for capabilities that aren't in any textbook. Martinez understood the implication. She'd worked on classified military projects before, had analyzed data from experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of known technology. But this data suggested something far beyond experimental. It suggested operational use of technology that operated outside conventional physics. Colonel, if I'm interpreting this correctly, Captain Morrow didn't just fly through impossible conditions. She navigated through what appears to be interdimensional space. The words sounded absurd even as she spoke them, but the data was unambiguous. These readings suggest flight through multiple layers of reality, transitioning between dimensional boundaries that theoretical physicists have only begun to hypothesize. The flight data recorder showed a journey that began in normal atmospheric conditions, but quickly moved into environments where the basic constants of physics became variable. Gravity fluctuated wildly. Atmospheric pressure readings suggested altitudes that didn't exist, and temporal measurements indicated flight duration that didn't match the aircraft's actual flight time. Dr. Martinez, how confident are you in this analysis? Walsh's question carried the weight of reports that would reach the highest levels of government. Colonel, I've triple-checked every calculation. This aircraft spent approximately 4 hours of flight time traveling through conditions that lasted subjectively less than 2 hours from the passenger's perspective. Captain Mora somehow navigated through dimensional boundaries that allowed her to take shortcuts through space-time itself. Martinez looked at the data one more time, knowing that her analysis would change everything. Colonel, what Captain Morrow did wasn't just exceptional flying. It was the practical application of physics that we're only beginning to understand. Outside the secured hangar, the damaged Boeing waited like a testament to capabilities that would revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. Martinez realized that her career analyzing conventional aircraft accidents had just become preparation for studying technologies that operated beyond the boundaries of the possible. Captain Elena Rodriguez couldn't shake the image of Ghost Rider's impossible landing as she sat in the pilot briefing room, surrounded by fellow F-22 pilots who peppered her with questions she couldn't answer. Her gun camera footage from the morning's intercept had already been classified beyond her clearance level, but the memory of watching that damaged Boeing dance through the sky would stay with her forever. Phoenix, what was it actually like, flying escort for a legend? Captain David Hawk. Stevens leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with curiosity. The briefing room buzzed with the excited energy of pilots discussing flying that transcended their normal understanding of what was possible. It was like watching poetry written in physics, Rodriguez said slowly, searching for words to describe the indescribable. That aircraft was damaged beyond any reasonable flight parameters, but she made it dance. I've been flying Raptors for 8 years, and I felt like a student pilot watching a master. The other pilots exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Stories of Ghost Rider's legendary skills had become part of Air Force folklore, tales passed down through generations of pilots who used her exploits as benchmarks for excellence. But those had always been historical accounts, stories from a different era of combat aviation. Today's encounter had transformed legend into living reality. Phoenix, did she actually say anything about what happened to her aircraft? Where she's been? Lieutenant Sarah Vixen Park's question carried the weight of professional curiosity mixed with genuine concern for a fellow pilot who had officially been dead for over 2 decades. Rodriguez shook her head. She kept the conversation professional, but she paused, remembering the confidence in Ghost Rider's voice, the casual authority of someone who had pushed aircraft beyond their design limitations and brought them home safely. There was something in her voice, like she'd seen things that changed her understanding of what's possible up there. The briefing room fell silent as pilots contemplated the implications. Each of them had pushed their aircraft to the edge of performance envelopes, had felt the thrill of flying machines that represented the pinnacle of human engineering achievement. But Rodriguez's description suggested capabilities that went beyond engineering, beyond the conventional boundaries that defined their understanding of flight itself. Major Gunner Williams, the squadron's most senior pilot, spoke into the silence. Phoenix, in your professional assessment, what kind of modifications would be necessary to achieve the flight characteristics